Today on Sports Central, we'll be going over your next final prediction of this offseason, and it will be over the Minnesota Vikings. And this is a team that was 11-5 in the 2019 season. They ended up having a great year, beating off the Saints, of course, in the wild card round. And yeah, all around a great season for the Minnesota Vikings. But how will they do in 2020 is what we're going over here today. We're also going to be going over your returning production along with a full preview and prediction on every game on the Vikings schedule heading into the 2020 season. With that being said, let's look at your season trends from 2019 for this team. Once again, they were 11-7 overall, and then they were 10-6 in the regular season. So this was a team that started off pretty slow. I mean, if you look at the beginning of their schedule, and especially in September, I mean, this Vikings team did not look very good, and they improved a lot over the season for sure. As you can see, once again, they finished off the season at 10-6. So yeah, this is a team that improved a lot. Between September and October, this team was 6-2, and then between November and the postseason, they were 5-5. So they were pretty consistent. I mean, they did kind of drop off a bit as we got to November and the postseason, but still, I mean, it was a great season for this Vikings team. Some of your key wins from last year: you beat off the Eagles, of course, 38-20. You also beat the Cowboys on the road, 20-24. That was a big win in November for this team, and they also beat the Broncos, 27-23 at home. And then they also had that big win at the Saints, 26-20 in the wild card round. That definitely was the signature win of the season for the Vikings, I would say. I mean, everyone knows how tough it is to play in New Orleans, let alone win. So that was a huge win for the Minnesota Vikings there to beat off the Saints on January 5th. As far as your returning production looks, of course, you return Kirk Cousins at quarterback, and that's going to be a big return for this team. Of course, he had 3,600 yards last season with 26 touchdowns and 6 interceptions. He also had nearly a 70% completion rate. So, yeah, he put up quite a season. I mean, he's a very polarizing quarterback is what I've noticed about him. I mean, most people like him, but, I mean, there's a few people that mostly hate him as well. I mean, you can't forget about that. And I think Kirk Cousins personally is a pretty underrated quarterback. I mean, a lot of people give him hate, but at the same time, I mean, looking at his stats, I mean, you can't forget that he had put up nearly a 70% completion rate last season, which that's one of the best in the NFL last season. And you also got to remember, I mean, 3,600 yards, that is pretty impressive for a quarterback. So at the same time, I mean, Kirk Cousins is still a quarterback that I think has got a lot of upside. And even though he's starting to get a little bit older, I still think Kirk Cousins definitely is a quarterback that could lead the Vikings to a good playoff run if he's able to, and if he's able to stay healthy for that matter. As far as the running back core looks, it looks really good for the Vikings next season. I mean, you got Dalvin Cook, your running back one, of course. He put up 1,600 yards, nearly 1,700 last season with 13 touchdowns, and he only had 4 fumbles. So Dalvin Cook was a great player for the Vikings last season, and that's going to be a big part of the reason why I think Minnesota could be a potential playoff contender next season. And they also returned their running back too, and Alexander Madison, which he was a very underrated quarterback last season. He did put up 540 yards with a touchdown. But at the same time, I mean, he still had a pretty good season, and I think he's definitely going to be able to put up a good season in behind Dalvin Cook. As far as the wide receiver core looks, of course, Stephon Diggs, your wide receiver one, is now with the Buffalo Bills, so he will not be with the Vikings next season, and that's going to be really interesting to see how Minnesota is able to deal with that. Of course, with Kirk Cousins, I mean, Stephon Diggs was Kirk Cousins' best target last season, and he's been that way for several seasons in general, and that's going to be a tough loss, I think, for the Vikings next season to lose Diggs. But at the same time, I mean, you still got a couple of really good receivers in there with Adam Thielen, and then you also got your tight end Kyle Rudolph, which both of those players put up some really good receiving yards last season. I mean, if you look at Stephon Diggs, of course, I mean, he put up 1,100 yards with 6 touchdowns, so he was by far the biggest target for the Minnesota Vikings last season. But at the same time, Adam Thielen, I mean, even though he didn't play a few games last season, he still put up 420 yards with 7 touchdowns. So, yeah, at the same time, I mean, Adam Thielen definitely is a wide receiver that has had better seasons, but at the same time, I still think he's a wide receiver that's got a lot of upside, and I think he's definitely going to probably be Kirk Cousins' biggest target next season, so he definitely needs to stay healthy if this Minnesota team is going to succeed. Kyle Rudolph is also coming back. Of course, he had 360 yards with 6 touchdowns last season, so he still had a pretty big season for this team as well. And then you do lose your cornerback Rhodes. Of course, Xavier Rhodes will no longer be with this team. Same with your defensive tackle Joseph, your defensive back Waynes, your defensive end Weatherly, and your cornerback Alexander. So you're losing a lot of players going into next season. There's going to be a lot of switch-ups for Minnesota heading into 2020, which does concern me in a way. I think at first, I mean, this Minnesota Vikings team could be a bit rusty, and we'll get to that in a second. But as far as players that they're bringing in defensive tackle Pierce and a wide receiver in Sharp, which, I mean, he's not really had all that big of an impact on any team so far in his career. So it's good that you're bringing in another receiver, but at the same time, it's got to be a good receiver, and I'm not sure whether the Vikings have that right now. Adam Thielen's really the only receiver that this team has in general right now, which does concern me. But you do have Kyle Rudolph, so that's good. But at the same time, once again, that does concern me a bit. Brings up the question, is Minnesota a dark horse contender in the NFC next season? And that is really tough. It's really tough to say right now. The Vikings, this is a team that's got some really good spots and some really rough spots. And I'd say Kirk Cousins next season, if he's able to improve and still be a good quarterback, I think this Vikings team could be right back in the playoffs. And, of course, you can't forget about Dalvin Cook. He has had injury problems in the past, but last season he was not that injured. And considering how healthy he was, he put up a great season. Definitely his best one of his career so far. So, yeah, Dalvin Cook is definitely a running back to watch out for. And, once again, it goes back to the receiving core and how they're losing Stephon Diggs. That does concern me quite a bit. But in the end, are they a dark horse contender? I think that they're a contender. I wouldn't say that they're a major one. I don't expect the Vikings to be a team to win the Super Bowl next season by any means. But I definitely think the Vikings should be able to make a run for the playoff. As far as the 2020 schedule looks, of course, you start off the season with the Packers at home, and that's going to be a big game for both teams in general in that NFC North. Of course, the NFC North is wide open right now with the Vikings, Packers. You also got the Lions. Don't sleep on them. And then you got the Bears, which was a team that was great in 2018, and they were pretty down last season. So you can't forget that they've still got a lot of potential to make a playoff run. So, yeah, you got several great teams in the NFC North division, so that's going to be a big game right off the bat for both teams. Then you got the Colts on the road, of course, on the 20th, another tough game. You got the Titans, who made the AFC Championship game last season, on the 27th. Then you got a road trip to the Texans and the Seahawks. So those first 5 weeks are going to be brutal for the Vikings. You got 5 really tough opponents and 5 teams that I think definitely should be able to make it to the playoffs next season. You also get the Falcons on the 18th, followed by the Packers on the road on November 1st. You got the Lions at home on the 8th, followed by the Bears on the road in Chicago on November 16th. And you have the Cowboys, Panthers, Jaguars, Buccaneers, Bears, Saints, and Lions in that order to finish off your season. So this is actually a pretty tough schedule, I would say. I think they've got one of the toughest schedules in all of the league. You got road trips to the Saints and the Buccaneers in December. And, of course, you also have to play the Packers twice. You got to play the Bears twice. You got to play the Cowboys as well. You can't forget about the road trips to the Texans and the Seahawks. So I think for the Vikings, that's going to be a big detriment for their season in 2020. But here's what I'm expecting out of your first 8 games, and this is going to sound crazy at first, and I'm going to get a lot of hate for this. I'm pretty aware of that by now, but I think that you do lose to the Packers in Week 1. I think that Packers game, that's going to be very close. I think the Vikings lead for a good chunk of that game, but the Packers and Aaron Rodgers in the end, I think they get the win in Week 1. Plus, Aaron Rodgers is going to be very, very motivated. You can't forget that they drafted Jordan Love at the quarterback position for the NFL draft. And honestly, for Aaron Rodgers next season, he's either going to be super motivated or he's going to want to get out of Green Bay, and he's not going to be very motivated. And he's going to be kind of something similar to what we saw in Tom Brady in the 2019 season. And in this fact, I think he's going to be motivated. I think he leads this team to a great season. But I think the Packers do get the win in Week 1. I also think you take a loss in Week 2 to the Colts on the road, and that's going to be a close one. But I think the Colts with Philip Rivers, they're looking pretty good right now as well. I do think you get your first win of the season against a good Titans team. So you're going to win that one. But however, I think you take losses to the Texans and the Seahawks. You're going to start off your season 1-4, and it's going to look horrendous for the Vikings next season, especially the beginning part of the season. But just wait, because the second half of the schedule is much better. But I do think you'd get a win against the Falcons at home. I do think you'd take a loss in Green Bay to the Packers. That's a tough place to play, especially at that point in the season. So I think the Packers get the win over the Vikings on November 1st as well. However, I think the Vikings get a win over the Lions on November 8th. So you go 3-5 in your first 8 games, which really, it seems pretty poor at first, but at the same time, you got to consider how many adjustments the Vikings are having to go through going into next season. They still got a lot of potential, I think, with Kirk Cousins, but you got to remember, they're losing like 6 main starters going into next season, which will be a big impact, especially at the beginning parts of the season. As far as the second half goes, though, this looks much better, I'm sure, for most Vikings fans. You're going to go 7-1, or you're going to go 8-1 for that matter for your last 9 games. I think you beat off the Bears, Cowboys, Panthers, Jaguars, Buccaneers, and Bears in back-to-back weeks. And I think the Vikings really get hot in the middle of November. I think once again, they start off slow. You start off with a 2-5 record. It doesn't look very good. But I think the Vikings, once they get adjusted to the new team, basically, because once again, they're losing 6 or 7 starters. I think that they definitely get on a hot streak, and I think they beat off the Lions, Bears once again. All of those teams. That includes a couple of big wins, especially against the Cowboys and the Buccaneers on the road. However, I do think you take one loss in that stretch, and that's going to be to the New Orleans Saints on the road. And I think that's going to be a close game. I mean, the Vikings won in their last season, but I think the Saints get the win in the end. It's going to be very close, but I think the Saints do get the win over the Vikings on Christmas Day. So, but yeah, I do believe you get a win over the Lions in Ford Field to finish off the season. So, yeah, you're going to go 10-6, and I think that there is definitely a good chance that they do, or that the Vikings do make the wild card at least next season for the NFC playoffs. So that's going to be really good for the Vikings, I think, in general. I mean, this is a team that's made some big runs in the playoffs in the past. I mean, you can't forget they were in the NFC Championship game a couple of seasons ago, and yeah, they beat off the Saints last season. So I mean, the Vikings definitely are a team that is good in the playoffs. They're just not able to make it quite to the Super Bowl, which, I mean, there's a chance that they can do that this season. I mean, looking at how they're going to get which I think they're going to get super hot in the last parts of the season, that's going to help them a ton heading into the playoffs. As far as your prediction stats go, you're going to go 7-1 at home. You're going to go 3-5 on the road, and then you're going to go 4-2 in the NFC North. Your only losses will be twice to the Packers, and then I think you go 8-4 in the NFC Conference. So, anyway, with that about wraps up our prediction on the Vikings. Let me know your thoughts in the comments below on this team. If you agree with the things here, I'd like to hear your thoughts once again. If you enjoyed this preview, be sure to slap a like on it and subscribe as well. It really helps out the channel. I'd really appreciate that. But as always, thanks again for watching. Stay tuned for more from All Sports Central, and I'll see you all later.